apparently millennials as a generation, which is a group of people who were born approximately 1984 and after, are tough to manage. And they're accused of being entitled and narcissistic, self-interested, unfocused, lazy. But entitled is the big one.
Surprise, motherfucker.
What's going on, everybody? Episode 9 of the Casual Millennials podcast. It is just moi, Andrew Jakubicz, one of your co-hosts. Eric, unfortunately, could not make it. He had an event in Racine from 5 to 7, and this was the only time we could get on our esteemed guest schedule, who is a very busy man. We just got done talking about it. And without further ado, our guest tonight is Dace McIninch, SVP of Marketing, Product Management, Strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on a long list at Fiserv. So, Dave, how's your night going? How are you?
It's wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. So, appreciate you to pronounce my last name correctly, too, by the way.
Hey, I tried. I practiced on my way here, so that's good. I'm glad I got it right.
Excellent.
And no, thank you for coming on. This is a small podcast, so we appreciate getting somebody like you on who has one of the best brains I've here around Fiserv. I think in many different ways. So I'm excited to dive into it tonight. That's for sure.
Sure.
So for the people who are listening who don't know who you are, give me the 1 to 2 minute spiel on kind of where you started and then how you ended up at Fiserv.
Sure. Started out, grew up in Ottawa, Canada. So I am not from America, but
first international guest.
There you go. This all of a sudden it's an international podcast. Just very regular kind of upbringing. Went to college out in the far East Coast. Started my career out in banking after I finished college, and very quickly decided that at least at the time that wasn't for me. And I can kind of bring that home later. But left that, did some management consulting, and then spent a decade in. I think I had seven jobs in 9 years, all the way through to the executive ranks with a company called ADP, which is the big HR payroll technology firm in the U.S. and Canada and international. Worked all over the world. Great experience, that sort of thing. And then I eschewed Fortune 500 life entirely and decided that I would never go back to Fortune 500. And I worked for a couple of venture-backed startups. So I was chief revenue officer for a marketing tech company and a true AI type company for a couple of years in Montreal, Canada. And then I left that when we sold it. And I went to another company. It was a VC-backed startup in financial technology. And a couple of things happened. And that's how I ended up at Fiserv with some colleagues that I used to work with back in the day at ADP. And when they presented the problem statement that faces this company and all the things that they wanted to do and how would that fit strategically and all this other stuff, I got pretty excited, and that's how I ended up here. So I've been here for 17 months, I think, 16, 17 months.
Nice.
Yeah.
So let's just bring this way back as you said you would. Why was banking for you? Too suit and tie for you? A couple of startups?
No, there was that. And so this is a true story. So it's 2000. It's 2000. And I worked for CIBC, which is a big global bank, top 20 bank, I think, top 30 bank in the world. And we were doing a branch transformation initiative and a rebrand and a bunch of other things. And we brought in new teller systems and we brought in new systems for guys like me. I was actually branch manager, I think, at the time, but I was a personal banker for a long time and loan officer or whatever. And someone sent me a file with a PowerPoint attachment on it in 2000. And I couldn't open it because we weren't running Windows 93, I guess it was, or 95, whichever one sort of was like the 95. 95 is a general support for all the Office suite and everything else like that. And this is in 2000.
Oh, in 2000. Oh, geez.
And I thought to myself, well, that's curious. And the bizarre part was I had to forward it to a friend of mine. He opened it for me. And it wasn't work related, but I had never seen a PowerPoint either. And I immediately thought to myself, I feel like maybe I'm not learning as many transferable skills as I'd like. Mm. And now, in retrospect, the answer is because my employer wasn't thinking about technology as an enabler of my success, the way they probably do today, by the way. So it's nothing disparaging at CIBC at all. But the sort of paradigm that a lot of our smaller community bank clients are in, as an example, as Fiserv, is representative of this idea that when the sea changes in technology hit, we should be able to be reactive to the needs of the next generation and the needs of the digital generation in general.
Sure.
And I felt really I was I was going to go into investment banking. I was going to do all this other stuff, and I always had a passion for tech. And that moment sort of tipped the scales for me. And then like 2 days later, someone tried to rob the branch, and I was like, okay, definitely out of here. So those two things happened in rapid succession. And that's why I left. And actually I got into management consulting in this tiny little competitive intelligence consulting firm. So this fascinating guy who was a major in the Canadian forces and ran the UN, one of the UN intelligence missions in Bosnia during the breakup of the old Yugoslavia.
Okay.
I was peacekeeper there for a long time. Came back to civilian life and decided that there were practical applications for military intelligence in the corporate world.
Sure.
And there was a burgeoning discipline called CI, which is pretty popular now, but at the time was sort of a growing thing. And that kind of coincided with the advent of Google and, for the most part, secondary research information online that's available for free and all sorts of other stuff. And so he felt like that was a good time. Started this little consulting firm. We ended up picking up a bunch of huge, like Fortune 500 brands as clients.
Wow.
And
how big was the shop? Just you two?
We were a dozen people, and then we got acquired by a technology firm in Helsinki.
Okay.
And they sort of took their sort of platform tech and married it to the sort of strategic insights we were bringing to the table and all the project work we were doing for our clients, and sort of married that together. And it's still a very, very successful going concern in CI. And that was really great because you'd like parachute into a situation as a young person, and you'd have to learn very quickly, like an entire operating model, business model, strategy, and then do a bunch of research to come back with a punch counterpunch kind of analysis on positioning, messaging, pricing. We did a lot of wargaming, a lot of scenario analysis, a lot of if-then type stuff.
Sure.
And we could do that with different access than if somebody from a competitive brand was asking the same questions that we were asking. So that was a lot of fun, actually. But after we got acquired by the Finnish technology firm, a lot of the more fun kind of consulting work disappeared and was replaced by SaaS revenue. So I was one of the early people displaced by automation and machine learning.
Got it.
And that's how I ended up at ADP, because I went and I started their competitive intelligence function.
Oh, really? So you started that whole division there?
Well, I started that for their Canadian business,
okay.
And then ended up leaving the Canadian business, went and ran marketing and strategy for international, for a global platform for a couple of years, came back to Canada, ran product management, marketing, then went back to the US business and ran marketing for their international division and their US enterprise business before I ended up leaving.
That's interesting. So talk me through, and this might be something I kind of want to just get some more insight on, and then I have a couple other questions on kind of what we're talking about. But so you go from CI to marketing. Now you're just basically, and we're not thinking about marketing and I'm going to create an ad, right? How do you explain marketing at your level that you're trying to do? Is it, can you just, why don't you just take that right there? Like, how do you explain marketing?
It's easy. There's no difference between marketing and business strategy.
Okay. So that I think is interesting, and for me, because I think people who are going to college, people who are in high school especially, think of marketing as just like advertising. Yep. And I think it's interesting and for me refreshing and different to hear that, because I never learned that even when I was in college. I took one marketing class, and all we talked about was basically who you're marketing towards, and that was, I think, that's all I can remember from it, to be completely honest with you.
No, I mean, like, to me, and again, there's a reason why they teach it like at a 4-year college, and it's 4 years worth of classwork, because can't boil it down to one thing.
Sure.
But to me, marketing really is business strategy. Business strategy, my role here, for instance, is to figure out ways to create sustainable competitive advantage.
Okay.
Like, that's my job.
Got it.
Marketing's job is to create sustainable competitive advantage. In many cases, marketing, even more so, their responsibility is to do that with or without all of the the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and create a vision and a brand and all these other things that go along with it to create competitive advantage for the company. There are different flavors based on the company's goals, aspirations, the markets they play in, what their winning aspiration is, like all those types of things. And the marketer has to figure out where the gaps are that they can skate their competitive advantage into. So if you're a big Sun Tzu fan, you attack where your enemy is weak and you retreat where they're strong. And so that's part of that as well.
You guys read The Art of War and you'll know everything.
That's right. You read The Art of War, you read von Clausewitz and all sorts of other stuff. And so I believe, like, business is a combination of war and sport, in at least philosophically.
Yes.
Certainly not practically.
Right.
But in sort of an esoteric fashion. And so, like, that's marketing's job. But if, for instance, when I work for a startup, And we're a high growth startup, 99.9% online digital customer acquisition. The way I create competitive advantage is to create operating leverage for my company. So every time for 2 startups in a row, one of my tricks is I go in there and the first thing I do is raise the price. So reposition, repivot into our strength, raise the price. Raising the price gives me operating leverage and creates a gap between cost to acquire and lifetime value of a customer. And then I can make better decisions about where I want to play based on the fact that I now have additional operating leverage.
Do you think going into those roles, especially as a CRO, and I worked at a startup before I came here.
Okay.
That was a SaaS company as well. And our CRO actually did the opposite, and basically we competed on price, unfortunately.
That is a strategic option, right? Michael Porter, right? Go back to school.
Yeah.
Cost leader. That's one of the options, although he later said that's not a good idea.
So there you go, to your point. It's a strategy. You're right. It is a strategy. Whether it's a good one or not is debatable. But do you think you were able to really grasp that and take that strategy and run with it because of the finance background that you had, whether it was within banking and kind of having that thought mentality of like an investment banker?
I have no finance background whatsoever. I had an undergraduate degree in American history.
Oh, that's right. I did see that today. See, and this is all leading towards why I like this podcast and actually why I started it, right? To give people, my young adults, college kids, like it doesn't always matter what you major in. It doesn't matter if you got a double major, you got a master's degree. You can take your career in any way you want.
Yeah.
How does someone go from a history major? How do you sell yourself? Like, what are your selling points? Is it really just I'm a quick learner, I can take anything, or do you just raise your hand and start doing everything?
Well, I think it's 2 things. The first is you have to find opportunities where they don't care about pedigree so much, right? Like what school you went to. Did they go to a big school or a small school? Did they go to a good school or a bad school? Did they do? Yeah, like none of that necessarily matters because there are lots of people that went to great schools that aren't that great, and lots of people that went to not very great schools that are amazing. And there's lots of research been done on top performing CEOs and the fact that they don't go to the Ivy League colleges as much and everything else. But to me, it was really less about that and it's more about mindset.
Okay.
And the things that sort of bring to the table that when I coach people on that are thinking about like kind of moving their career forward, is the first is just understand the motivations of the business and how they make money, right? You don't need a finance degree to do that. Right. Every business has 5 to 7 key levers. Just understand how they get pulled and how they what the interplay is between the levers. And the second thing is just have a genuine curiosity for everything, which you can learn whether you take a geography degree, an art history degree, a finance degree. It doesn't matter what your background is. If you're genuinely curious about things, and you never really lose that passion for improving yourself and your learning. Then you can really accomplish anything. And those 2 things combined with probably the most important thing for me, at least, which is a fairly dogged work ethic. And the idea that, you know what, if I walk into a room and or into a situation, maybe I'm not the smartest person there, or I don't have the best degree, but I'm willing to do 16 hours for every 14 they put in, then over time I'll make up the gap, no problem. Right. Sure. And that sort of that attitude, whether you actually do the 16 hours or not, like the attitude is the thing that matters, and the ability to say, like, I'm not going to be outworked at the end of the day. At a minimum, I'm not going to be outworked.
Right, because it's the one thing that you can control going into that situation, and that's how you got to remember that.
That's right.
So let's just stick on this topic for a second here. Let's say your advice, a person 3 to 5 years into their career maybe realizes, hey, I'm not in the right spot where I want to be, but I've tried this over here, whatever it may be. How does one transition from there? And let's say in the same company and potentially outside that company.
Okay. In the same company, I think the key is to search for sponsors and mentors, and understand that typically a mentor is not a sponsor. Okay.
Elaborate on that, please.
So sponsors are people that can help your career. Mentors are people that are going to help you get better.
Okay.
People, in my opinion, they often mistake those 2 things, and they often conflate one for the other or believe that they're the same. Mentors are people that can sit you down, and good mentors will have a program and walk you through, like, show me what you're working on today, where are you having problems, where do you feel like you're strong, where do you feel like you're weak, and as you learn that, they will assign you homework to go and work on your weaknesses or sharpen your saw for all your strengths.
Sure.
In many cases, you want to find a mentor that's not in your line of business, but you don't necessarily need to look for people that are immediately going to help you get the next job. Okay. That's what sponsors are for. The benefit of the mentor is a mentor can have a significant influence on sponsors, but usually your sponsor is going to be somebody who understands your work product at a detailed level. And so, your boss can be a sponsor, and in some companies, the size of the business really matters, and the roles that you have oftentimes matters. And so, your boss just may not be able to help your career that much because, you're at a certain place in an org chart, or you're in a small company or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And your mentor is going to be able to give you better options. And that's the other important thing, is maybe your mentor doesn't even work in that company to begin with, right? Really does depend on the situation.
Sure.
And then the other thing is, like, the tricky part is, if it's 3 years, is that too long? Is it not too long? There's lots of talk about whether we're patient enough with our time, and, and then organizationally, the culture will either value advancing people quickly, or they won't, or, they have a series of criteria that they think that people should meet. And so sometimes there's all those combinations of things you have to be cognizant of.
Sure.
And then lastly, sometimes it's a math problem.
Okay.
Like, there can only be one VP. So you have 5 people that want to be VP, and there's only one VP role. Sometimes it's a math problem.
Yep.
Right. And so you have to make those decisions, or at least be cognizant of those things.
Right.
But it really does depend on your situation and your employer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to say with certainty. But I just like sponsor or mentor kind of thing. Like, I really do believe that that's important.
I think that's great advice. So let's stick on this concept of being cognizant of the time. So, because you said something, and I think you said it was in ADP, it's 7 jobs in 9 years, right?
Yeah.
Okay. 7 jobs in 9 years. Was that like about a little over a year in a job?
Yeah, it's like a year and a bit in the job, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and this is a kind of a reoccurring theme, because one stereotype of my generation is considered to be job hopping.
Yep.
Now, whether that means from company to company, job to job, inside those companies, I'm not necessarily sure. It depends on probably who is using that term and defining it.
Yep.
But what do you say to that? Because 7 jobs in 9 years could be seen as that.
Yep.
And then how do you kind of spin that? And as a younger person, sorry to layer on top,
Yep.
how do you make those decisions of if it is the right time to switch jobs?
Yeah. So, okay. First thing is 7 jobs, 9 years. 3 out of the 7, I think, were promotions.
Okay.
Right. So there was that. But the second thing is, the only reason why I had the opportunity I think I had was, A, there's some element of timing and luck and some other stuff like that.
Sure.
B, I had great sponsors and mentors. And so in one case, I was an enterprise sales rep in Canadian business. And the guy that used to run enterprise sales for Canada went over to was the GM over the European business.
Okay.
And they were spinning up a new division focused on global Fortune 500s, and they needed a marketing person. And I came from a marketing background, and they were like, we should go get Dave. Right. So I didn't have anything to do with that job. They came and got me.
Got it.
And on a couple, and of the roles that I had, with some small exceptions, almost all of them were net new.
Okay.
So they created a new role, and they tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, do you want to do this thing?"
Well, that's impressive and nice for you.
Well, I mean, timing is everything too.
Yeah.
So maybe I just got lucky. But the important part of that was, they would have offered that job to lots of people, because a lot of them were dangerous jobs. So they knew jobs were dangerous jobs.
Sure.
Like, hey, do you want to walk point in front of the entire platoon? Yeah, that's a dangerous job.
Yes, it is.
And what I've found is, to answer your second question,
Mhm.
like, never, and I can't remember exactly what the saying is, but it's reasonably popular, but don't be afraid to take risk. And do something that scares you all the time is actually really important. So I've always found that if I looked at a role where it was risky, but the reward, the upside was really interesting, then I'd probably skate towards that. Because at the end of the day, I'm not walking point in front of a platoon. I'm sitting at a desk. Yeah. And so, it's not that physically, there's not a lot of risk there. Yeah. And so if I felt like it was a good decision and it gave me access to a lot more of a broader toolkit, then that's what I did. Sure. And so, you can imagine working for, even as an executive, so, top executive, even within the construct of ADP, our business unit was worth like 5% of total revenue or something like that, right, in the Canadian business, until I went into the U.S. business again. And then all of a sudden we were worth a third. Wow. And so the only way you do that is to liberate yourself from your current paradigm. You have to decide to take risk and move and do other things. Like, there's no other way to do it. Yeah. Right. And by the way, just as an aside, if you sit around and wait for people to tap you on the shoulder, it's probably not going to happen, which is why I do say I did get lucky a couple of times, where I think right place, right time kind of stuff. Sure. And I knew the right people, and I made the relationships and fostered those, both with sponsors and mentors.
which helps a lot. And then, and also just to pile on top is your work ethic too. Like that stands out probably for most people, and that's kind of why your name popped into their head as well.
Maybe
not kissing your ass too either. So trust me, I'm just probably.
That was a long time ago anyway.
Yeah, that's fair. So yeah, but then to that last question there is like, if I'm sitting in a job waiting to get tapped on the shoulder per se, or kind of being a little bit stagnant, when do you decide like maybe it is time to move? Because there is some risk in even just looking potentially in the culture of your job could be.
I don't know. I
situationally, obviously.
Yeah,
obviously trying to generalize something that depends.
Yeah, if you're like fundamentally unhappy, which luckily I've never really been in a job, but if you're fundamentally unhappy, like you should probably go do something else. And the reason for that is also just, I'll tell you a quick story. Yeah. So I'm sitting on a plane 2 days ago from Detroit rather, to Milwaukee. Okay. And the guy beside me is PhD psychologist, co-founder of an HR technology startup using data science and cognitive psychology to better screen candidates for fits for jobs. And the first thing I said to him was, well, how does your algorithm screen for motivation? And he said, that's a very good question. We've been working on this problem for quite some time. And the answer is like, how do you test on someone's like overall motivation? Like how, like to sort of skate into the difficult stuff, and then they give you discretionary effort, because that's really how we measure motivation. Okay. And that answer is very difficult to determine, right? Like how do you figure that out? But if you're unhappy in your job, like your motivation is zero. Right. So that equation is actually quite simple.
Yes.
Right. And so if you feel like if fundamentally you're unhappy, specifically because the work isn't challenging or whatever, less about like, did I get promoted, did I not get promoted? But if you're really not fundamentally putting yourself in a position where you're doing your best work, and I would never say put in a position, because most people are at work voluntarily. And
True.
you
chose to go there at the beginning.
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, listen, we've all chosen to go somewhere and then be like, well, I don't like it here.
Yep.
But more importantly is you choose to stay. Like every day you show up, you're in charge of your own engagement and you're in charge of your own motivation. And so those are two factors that you can control as well. Mm-hmm. And if the circumstances of your work are such that you just can't get there, then you probably should look for another job. Okay. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that in the long run, your employer benefits from that sort of ability to be self-aware as much as you do. But at the end of the day, I think you're trying to find things that give you the opportunity where when you're putting in discretionary effort over and above the expectation, it doesn't even feel like work because you enjoy it. Right?
That's 100% true. And I think I found that coming from, because I started in public accounting and then went to a startup, right? So in public accounting, it's basically you're expected to work a large amount of hours, and I did not like my job. I didn't like what I was doing, and I worked the minimum hours I could. I was like, I'm just getting my job done and get out of here. Yeah. When I ended up going to the startup, I found myself working the same or more hours, but because I felt like I was driving something forward, I felt more engaged in my work and I had more fun. And that's just to your point there. Like, it's so true how much different it can be from when you dislike your job to when you actually enjoy what you're doing. One question I want to talk about, and I wanted to get to before the end of this, because I think it's an interesting dynamic, because I'm an individual contributor here at Fiserv, and now you're an SVP. And with your specific skill set, focusing on strategy, thinking about those 5 to 10 year goals and how to pivot towards those, it's very interesting because your mind is all the way up there while I'm sitting down here kind of walking the whole thing along, right? How does an individual contributor really get to understand the 5 to 10 year plan, understand their role in it, as well as understanding how you guys think about us as individual contributors and how we can help move everything along?
Well, the first thing is your boss should be communicating the strategy of the business to you properly. So if we have a management communication challenge, we'll take that up offline.
In general, maybe.
No, I know. But I think the aspirations and the goals of the business should be well known throughout the entire company. Yep. And that you get a bit of a force multiplication effort if everybody understands which way to row the boat, which is very helpful, especially for large companies, because it's just a big boat and it takes a long time to get moving and all that sort of thing.
And a long time to turn them too.
And it's a difficult time to turn them. But understanding at an individual contributor level how you can maximize your RPMs, right, and assist in that is important too. Yep. And that's a dialogue, again, oftentimes with you and your manager or somebody else to understand kind of where you fit in the world and why what you're working on is important and all that sort of thing. And asking those questions is really valuable. Okay. In many cases, because if your manager doesn't know the answer to that question, then they themselves will go and find out. And then it has a really positive effect. Sure. And that communication works really well. But the second thing is, some of the best ideas come from from people all over the company that are individual contributors or in some other part of the business because they're connected to a problem statement that we're trying to solve for.
Okay.
So, our frontline service people talk to clients every day, very connected to the client experience. Mm-hmm. Do we have a mechanism to farm that feedback, analyze it, make decisions based on it, or at least incorporate that in our product strategy or solution strategy or market strategy, whatever. Okay. And similarly, everybody in an individual contributor role has some sort of unique insight into the experiences that the business is having, the market is providing, or the client is having, and just keeping your head up every once in a while to understand, is what I'm working on in context of the big picture strategy, like, can I contribute to that?
Sure.
Right. And then again, if you lack clarity, like, asking the question is really important, because those of us you'll find that as you grow in your career and you start to manage people and you start to get into leadership positions, that there's this weird gulf between, like, people who know stuff at the grassroots and then the executive. And oftentimes people will assume the executives are well informed about these things, mm-hmm. and then never say anything. And then, 6 months, a year goes by and they're like, why are these guys not doing this? Like, can they not see this? And they're like, no, your job is to tell me what's happening at that level. That's how this works.
Exactly.
I tell you what's going on over here. You tell me what's going on over there. And so fostering those dialogues is really important. And then you get the opportunity to contribute too. And then it helps again with the context, and it's like a flywheel effect. This is a really positive feedback loop.
Sure. That is a great answer. And I think will help a lot of people too, especially maybe going into companies, like they're just getting out of college, going into a company, because when you're brand spanking new and you've never worked really outside of maybe being an intern, it's really hard because you'll drown in new things, understanding the whole job that you're just doing, much less the broader company, no matter how big of a job or corporation you're at. So I think that's an interesting way to think about that. One thing that is interesting, and I wanted to get your thought on, because you've been a people manager for a while now, you've been in a lot of different positions. What are your thoughts on, like, important things for somebody who is beginning to take over a leadership position now? Now they are managing people. Yeah. What are the first couple of things, any advice that you would give them and things to look for?
Well, it's tricky, right? Like I think most new leaders get stricken with imposter syndrome.
Okay.
Right? They just like sit in their office and like in the evenings and they look around and like, is anyone going to notice I don't know what I'm doing?
Yeah, like I shouldn't be here.
And it takes you a while to kind of work through the imposter syndrome, because, and the thing I like to coach people on is, now I'm giving away all my secrets here. No one's going to ask me for any help.
Well, now nobody will listen to it. So
I'll send it around. The piece of advice I give people is give yourself the job first.
Okay.
Like, number one, if you become a manager or VP, it doesn't matter. But if you feel like you're kind of like flailing and you're in that imposter, because it's like it's a stage you're going to go through. Like, the first thing is to remember that you got the job and give yourself the job first, right? And you feel good about that, and then that'll help you not second guess, and you'll probably, all the things that come to you instinctively will work properly instead of second guessing things you normally would never second guess.
Sure.
Right? Because once your self-talk gets in there, like, all of a sudden now it's like a regulator. Like, they're looking at every transaction all of a sudden, every synapse that's firing. I mean, meanwhile, usually you just let it go.
Yeah.
But then the other important thing is to sit down with your leaders and other folks and just ask a hell of a lot of questions, right? Because especially if you go into the same job and they've promoted you into a new role,
okay,
they know all about you. Like, it's not going to be a surprise that they're not going to wake up one day and be like, "Wow, I just really know you didn't manage people. That's weird." Right? They will know.
Wait, when did you get here?
Yeah. And so they should ask, asking questions is the sign of intelligence typically. Mm-hmm. I am significantly more concerned with people that don't ask questions than people who do.
Right.
Depending on the nature of the question.
Fair enough.
But for the most part. And the thing that helped me through that, this is more situational, but in the transition between working for Fortune 500 to going to startup. Yeah. And I know your boss has circulated this as well at some point, but there's a book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, by Ben Horowitz.
I have not read that yet.
It's the best book on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. It's a
hard thing
about hard things.
About hard things.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Ben Horowitz has started and sold a number of different companies, and he's the Horowitz and Andreessen Horowitz, one of the most successful venture capital firms in the Valley. He and Mark Andreessen worked together. Andreessen started the Mosaic browser, which became Netscape. And I mean, these are very big brains and very, very successful people. And Horowitz's book is amazing because it's extremely expository about the struggles he had as a startup founder, as he's gone through different companies, and then his company was acquired by HP. And it's very much like stories from the front, and very specific. But he also has a ton of management knowledge in that book. And then, recommendations around things like hiring an executive and firing an executive, and why it doesn't work when you hire a big company executive too early in your company. And, reading that really, was like a manual for how not to get fired as I went to work for a startup. And I was like, oh my God, I better do this stuff.
There you go.
But some of it was also just like very practical leadership experience. And you don't have to be a CEO to read that book and glean a lot of insight from it.
Sure.
And I think, and it just happened because of the timing of a lot of his experiences, is a bit of a nice history lesson on the early days of the internet, enterprise technology, SaaS. And so that's got kind of a nice, kind of a little bit of a history background as well.
Yeah, for sure. I can see how that would be really interesting to read.
Yeah, fascinating book. It's not safe for work from a language perspective. I do have to point that out.
Well, neither is my boss. Yeah, he's still here.
Well, listen, you have to be sensitive to some of the language in the book because it's pretty clear. He does have a section actually on why profanity at work is acceptable. So,
there you go.
So it may not be sanctioned by all HR organizations everywhere, but it's a really great read, and it's unbelievably valuable from an insight perspective.
Sure. Well, I'm for sure going to give it a read now. So a couple other questions, and then we can get you back to the rest of your life, which is work and getting checked in the hotel finally this late in the evening.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about, and it was something that I really had to transition when I went from my startup to come here. So you went from Fortune 500 to a startup, then kind of another startup, obviously, but then finally back to Fortune 500. Talk me through your adjustment period of going to such a fast-paced environment and then back maybe necessarily to a larger kind of, like, as we said, it's harder to start, it's harder to turn cruise ship that you're now running.
Well, again, like Horowitz actually mentions this in his book, and I've taken this as like a key principle for me, and I've expounded upon it. Okay. And someday when I write my book, which will be long from now because you need free time to write books.
True. Or a ghostwriter.
In my opinion, it is a complete and total misnomer to assume that startups work faster or harder than big companies do.
Okay.
In a big company, it's like moving a very, very large enterprise, right? So you've got lots of moving pieces and all kinds of other things, and especially as you become more senior in your career and you just start to work cross-functionally amongst a bunch of things, and you will find that your calendar is not yours. It belongs to everybody else, and it belongs to your team, and it belongs to everything. And so what you'll find is that the constraints on your time in a big company are tremendous.
Sure.
And the hours of activity that are created by other people for you far outpace the ones you create for yourself. So then it's about time management, carving out time to think, figuring out when you can do the things that are needed to be done, and everything else like that. But if anyone were to tell me that people work harder in startups than they do in big companies, I would suggest that maybe they're just not at the right place in the org chart yet.
Okay.
Or their startup is a very, very hyper-growth, fast-moving company where they really are they're employed for a reason, and that reason is because they're going to work you 18 hours a day until you burn out, and then they're going to go get somebody else.
Yeah,
right?
fair.
And then the other challenge with that, relative to my calendar comment, especially as an executive, you walk in on day one of a startup, you open your calendar, it is completely empty. And one of your biggest responsibilities is to fill it.
Okay.
So the first thing you get to do is you get to fill that calendar however you like, with ideally, if you're good at your job, high value, impactful activity, 80-20.
Yep.
Because nobody really actually does that 100%. So 80-20 rule, staff meetings don't count. A couple of other things don't count probably. Early days, you spend a lot of time learning and walking around and doing all that sort of stuff.
Meeting everybody, getting all of that.
But there is a threshold, which in startups is probably 30 days. In bigger companies, you might get a little longer rope, where you're going to have to start adding value. Yep. And the benefit is that you can control your calendar to the degree that you can spend your time on things that add value, right? But the startup's expectation is faster because every day that the startup is in business, they're running out of cash.
Yes.
And so your job is to figure out ways to not be a strain on cash burn. And if you're an executive, you're an expensive resource, you're contributing to burn, and you should figure out ways not to do that as fast as possible by asking lots of questions and creating your own activity. In big companies, you're pushed and pulled in a lot of different directions. It's an interruption-driven schedule, right? And so baking 3 hours to go sit at a whiteboard and try and solve a problem, like unless it's Saturday or Sunday, you're not going to get the time.
Sure.
Right? And so over time, as you gain experience, all you're really doing is playing probabilities and shaving off the edges on some of this stuff because you've seen this movie before, you've done that before, you understand how this works, and then the experience kind of compounds upon itself. But those two things are really, really dynamically different. And then it depends on your role within the company too. Like if you're in a startup, by the way, if you're an engineer and you're in a startup and they put you on a team, there's a pretty decent structure around that, and a clear definition of what they want you to do. And you just have to figure out ways to contribute quickly. And usually you have to earn your stripes before you can then start, in a sprint review or in sprint planning and say, hey, I think we should do this. Right. So there's that. And that's what I love about startups. Like you can't friggin' hide in startup.
Nope.
Like there's zero hiding. There's none of this like, well, I manage a thing and a process and then like
what is
nothing.
it you say you do here?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's basically it. And in startups, like you're always going to be held in good ones. You're going to be held accountable for the performance, and there's nowhere to hide.
No, and everybody knows who the high performers are, and everybody knows who isn't. And it's very interesting how it's like that. So two more questions, and then we'll let you go. So one I want to talk about, which is you mentioned time management. And as an executive, I can imagine how it's even very important for you to manage that time for all the reasons you just suggested. As a person early in their career, not necessarily a lot of interruption driven job. It is more kind of just cranking out spreadsheets or, working SQL, whatever it may be in any profession. How does one manage their time well from a corporation's perspective and your job's perspective? But also, how do they apply those skills to their life? And for example, a very selfish question I'm asking because I've piled a lot on my plate as of recently. Just mentioned I started rolling in BJJ. Now I host 2 podcasts on top of this. I teach 1 night a week at a college here in town. Great. So I'm doing all of that, and I think I'm fairly good at managing my time, but I would love to hear some additional strategies as well as I think some people listen to this.
Yeah. So to suggest that one should be good at managing one's time is not to suggest that I'm particularly good at managing my time. So let me point that out.
Fair enough.
And certainly with, usually being out of the house 4 or 5 days a week, my time management is a lot simpler. Okay. Like if I live in a hotel 4 nights a week,
what else can you
do that or watch ESPN.
Yeah.
Right. So that actually makes it a lot easier. If I were home taking kids to soccer and doing all those other things, those constraints on your time are real.
Yeah.
And then it's about making sure that you can kind of say, I'm spending 80% of my time on the top 5 most important things to me and the company and my job. In your life, the time management bit is really just doing things that give you energy. Like whatever feeds a lot of energy for you and the things that you enjoy doing, like it's never going to feel like work. And it's kind of like working out, like you can, even if you're really tired, you get off a long flight or something like that. And if you can just muster the energy to get your shoes on and go for a run or do something like that. The first 5 minutes suck.
Oh yeah.
And you're just thinking of all the reasons why you don't need to do this.
Sometimes the first 30 suck.
Yeah. Sometimes the first 30 suck too. Yeah. And you're just like I'm not being chased by a bear. There's no reason for me to be doing this. Yep. But eventually you kind of you fall into your rhythm. And by the time you're done, all the endorphins are firing and you feel great. And if you're spending your time in your evenings or other things in your life, just try and do the things that give you energy. And in some cases, like, let's be honest, like sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're caring for a sick parent or a sick child, or there's something else that's happening in your personal life or whatever that's robbing you of energy. And then on the time management front, it's just trying to figure out, like, what can I do that's an outlet for positive energy? And I've always been lucky enough to have work be that positive outlet. And so that in and of itself is a positive feedback loop. It's a big flywheel. Got it. Because if I can come to the office and have some of those other problems kind of flushed away and I feel like I can contribute and, I'm doing good work or I'm solving hard problems or whatever else it is, like that, and then you can try to skate from a time management perspective, try and focus your energy on that kind of stuff.
And almost take that positive feedback that you get from your positive feedback loop, whatever that may be, and into those maybe more negative problems and hopefully help drive those away or whatever it may be, because life always happens. And that's one thing we can't get away from.
That's exactly it. And so it is important to note, like sometimes honestly, you just got to take the L. Yeah. Right. Like some days the universe is not handing you a W today. Right. But it's a long season. Yep. You just got to take the L and then like shut it down, start it again tomorrow. Try and figure out opportunities for positivity the next day, and just like don't wallow in the L and kind of sit in your misery, unless like, because I have a bit of a bizarre thing. I get some of my energy from that whole thing. It helps feed my I have a bit of an aggressive side in some cases. So if I can like harness that, but really, I end up turning that into more positive energy over time. But sometimes it sucks and you just got to take the L.
I mean, for example, like I was at jiu-jitsu before. It's like I choked out 4 times. Like I wasn't happy about that.
Yeah.
Like nobody likes that.
Yeah.
Like my throat's still hurt.
Yeah, you did not win jiu-jitsu this
I
evening.
did not win. I took the L, but I'm gonna go back tomorrow and I'm gonna try to do better. And you're gonna take all the things you learned from whatever mistakes you made and try to hopefully not make them again. And I think that's interesting and something I think everybody needs to be reminded of, because sometimes you can get in a negative feedback loop, and sometimes maybe hearing this or even just thinking it yourself will knock you out of it, or at least get you on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at sports analogies are crude, but I like them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Bill Parcells, one of the greatest coaches in NFL history, if you actually look at his playoff record, he's like a 65% win record, maybe.
Okay.
The Bill Belichick's of the world have a very, very strong winning record, but they're absolute statistical anomalies. Some of the greatest coaches in the world have almost mediocre records in the playoffs. Because guess what? It's really freaking hard to win a Super Bowl.
Yes.
Right? If you look at the spread between the golfers that finish at the 100 mark versus those that win, the delta in the difference in shots can be as small as 5 or 6 per round.
Correct.
Like it isn't a massive gap between winners and losers, but it is just the people that are consistently just a little bit better at all the aspects of the game that end up being successful.
Mm-hmm.
And life is like that too. Like nobody's walking around with a 90% win record. And if they are, they're not trying anything. So like, great. You have a 90% win record because you literally played 10 times and you won 9 out of 10. And the rest of us are playing at 1,000.
Yeah.
Like you can't that win record doesn't scale. And so I find people get really wrapped up in this idea, coming out of college or whatever, you're a 4.0 GPA or you're always been successful. You never got a B on an exam in your life. Yeah. Like, congratulations. Life is friggin' B's. Like, normalized against a long enough timeline, we're all going to scatter graph around, B plus. Right. And so, lamenting too much of this stuff too early on is not good for your mental health. And it's a very long game that you're playing. As long as you can gain some learning from the things you didn't do well, then, I think that's okay. I just feel like, in many cases we're like overly encouraging people to achieve as though somehow batting 1,000 over 30 years is actually a thing that happens.
Right.
Right.
And a lot of people who are winning 90% of the time aren't even getting out of their comfort zone, or they're doing the one thing that they know they're 100% good at. And that's not good for your personal development either. Yeah.
Well, that all depends. I mean, we're assuming a certain amount of ambition that some people just don't have.
Sure.
Right. And I've come to, over the course of my many years on the planet, I've come to sort of realize that sometimes that's okay. Like, some people have ambition for things that are not work related entirely. And that's in some cases incredibly well adjusted. Yeah. Right. If people are more passionate about their family and would rather take a job where they can guaranteed 40 hours a week, and they're willing to say, I'm willing to earn this much to do that because that means I get to spend this much time with my kids every night or something like that. Mm-hmm. That equation, as long as you're comfortable with that equation, that's a really great decision.
It all just comes back to being self-aware. Really. Yeah. As understanding what you want.
Yeah.
Because then you set yourself up to get to those things that you want.
Yeah. And by the way, what you want is going to change over time as well. Right. And that's so, I think this is what makes good strategists is the same thing that makes good defensive backs, which is very, very short memories in some cases.
Okay. And
so you go through a bunch of iterations, you do a bunch of work, you sort of show up with the layer cakes all baked and ready to go. And this beautiful masterpiece of a, whatever it is, slide deck, positioning paper, whatever. And then someone goes, "Oh, it sucks for these 3 reasons." And you go, "Oh, wow, that's really good feedback." And you're like, "Oh, you gotta go back to the drawing board."
Thanks for the feedback.
Thanks a lot. You're right.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned you didn't like chocolate cake. I forgot about that.
Yep.
And so, and you just have to kind of figure out like what you learn from those experiences and just move on. And
yeah, I mean, that's the most important thing is learning from those.
Yeah.
All right, last question. This is one we ask all of our guests.
Okay.
I think I'm interested to hear the answer. So we talk about, especially right now with millennial generation, Gen Z, a lot of the tech companies don't necessarily give a shit if you went to college or not. Maybe they're looking for somebody actually who didn't even go to college.
Yep.
So one thing we've been asking people of all ages and our guests, do you regret going to college?
No.
And so why?
Sorry. Okay.
No, why? Yeah, go ahead. No, why?
No, God, no. So I met my wife in college.
Okay.
So I should probably mention that in the unbelievably unlikely event she listens to this, even if I said it to her. So there is that. So I can't possibly regret that. I left home and I traveled 1,200 miles to a place I'd never been to go to college in a part of the country that had a very different culture and different approach. That was a phenomenal learning experience. So I don't regret that at all. I really loved the city I was in, played lots of sports, had a great time, met tons of great people. And then I kind of closed the book on that part of my life because it was a small town and I'm a big city guy. And so I went and I decided to find a big city and I go do some other stuff. And the lessons I've learned, like some of the stuff that I read in college, I still go back and read, or I would never suggest that it made me worse.
Okay.
But it was also something I really wanted to do.
Okay.
Like I just wanted to leave home and like kind of go venture out into the world.
Yeah.
And, you get punched in the face once in a while when that happens too. So it wasn't, again, every once in a while you're going to catch an L. That's okay. Yeah. And, learned a lot about the value of the dollar on student loans and, $20 a week and drinking money and all that other good stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like none of this, daddy wasn't writing big checks and doing all that kind of stuff. And so there's a certain amount of empowerment and self-fulfillment with that. Mm-hmm. But then I didn't really come into my own until after I finished college and sort of hit the workforce and then decided what I wanted to do for a living, which took, and it was really more esoteric. Like I would like to be this sort of image that I had for myself, not I want a job that does that.
Got it.
And that was it. And so I don't regret going to college at all, but for those types of reasons, not because I felt like my degree helped me, or there are lots of employers that insist on having a college degree still. So if you're comfortable not working for them because you don't have one, then great.
Yeah.
Tech companies are recruiting just like really brilliant kids that are gonna, if they went to college, would crush it.
Right.
So the benefit there is, and I worked with the head of engineering at my last company. It was an absolute genius. Like, I think he got a job at Advanced Microdynamics, building silicon chips when he was 16 or 17. Like he was like a total genius. And he firmly believes that the best engineers are the ones that are the best communicators. Okay. It's not something that they teach at all in engineering school.
Yeah.
And interestingly, they're finding people with really creative backgrounds that can go now and you can do a 16 or 18 week boot camp and learn Python or learn Ruby on Rails or whatever.
Sure.
And they're bringing in these different perspectives into what is usually a very static way of learning. Mm-hmm. And that's what these startups like, because they need people that can help break paradigms and solve hard problems. And in many cases, they just lock these guys in a room, or people in a room. I shouldn't say guys at all. People in a room and say, here's a really thorny problem. None of us have a clue how to fix this. All you smart people in here are just going to figure it out. And then that's where you get the I've lived on Mountain Dew for 3 straight days thing.
Yep.
Not because they were asked to, but because there's a passion for that problem solving. Right. And they're not going to teach you that in college. They're going to teach you how to be afraid to turn your assignment in late. But they're not necessarily going to teach you to stay up for 3 straight days because you have a passion for solving a problem. Mm-hmm. But colleges do provide you with an opportunity to test that out.
Sure.
Right. So I don't know. That's a bit of a wishy-washy answer. But you asked me what my personal experience was. I loved going to college.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the experience. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about what I wanted to do, what I didn't want to do.
Sure.
I have lots of regrets about taking a history degree, right?
Do you?
Oh,
I don't know. You're very successful.
I know. So it's tough to figure out. But like I was such a friggin'
what did you think you were going to do?
Altruistic, like passion for learning, and I had like a really just pig-headed view of the world, but it was so stupid. And meanwhile, I luckily my passion for history translated into a passion for economics and a passion for business history, and that's how I ended up kind of have with the worldview that I have today. Because I always felt like, specifically history, but history and political science, what I studied, and I got my degree in history because I was 1 credit short on poli-sci. I would have had both.
Okay.
But both of them are very, very interrelated, interspersed. Mm-hmm. But there is almost always an economic element to it that's overlooked. Mm-hmm. So whether you're talking about like the origin and causes of some foreign war or anything else like that, economics plays a role in virtually all human behavior to some degree or another. And I felt like the humanities kind of missed the role economics plays in starting wars and funding Western expansion and building canals and roads and bridges and all the things that make us the thing that we are today.
Right.
So that's sort of where I had this like passion for learning that deviated off the path. But I was just like a pig-headed idiot. And I would go and like write a paper about economic history when the assignment was not that. And I would hand it in and be like, yeah, but this is really important. And the professor would be like, are you kidding me?
That's not what I asked you to do.
The assignment is Huckleberry Finn. Why did you write this paper on the origins and causes of the Great Depression? I'm like, because of the relationship between the post-Civil War South. And they just look at me like, what's wrong with you? Right? So I probably could have done that better.
That's probably fair, yeah. You got out there with the degree, out of it with the degree, though.
I did eventually, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think they gave it to me just to make me leave.
That may be.
Yeah. Torturing all the professors, you got to go.
Oh man, professors. Yeah, I tortured enough of them in my day. Okay, yeah, that was kind of what I was actually. I mean, I could sit here and talk for hours, and I don't want to keep you. But is there anything else maybe you want to touch on that you had an idea, thinking coming into this? I want to talk about this that I didn't lead you to or ask you about.
Maybe one, just because of like the title of your podcast and everything.
Sure.
Is that they typically ask people like me what we think of millennials or Gen Z or whatever we're called now.
Mm-hmm.
First thing I would remind you is that people of my vintage still believe that we're young at heart.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
We just don't look it. The packaging has faded, but the passion is still the same.
Okay.
But I am positive if you dug up a New York Times editorial from 1857, there would be someone who had written the young people today don't know XYZ, haven't done this, and like constantly complaining because that's just what people of one generation sometimes do for the younger generation.
Yes. And
so I really I struggle with those, though, even just the categorization Gen Z and Gen Y and all those other things, because we're all a collection of our collective experiences. And some people have different experiences than others. Okay. So age cohorts is an interesting and potentially statistically significant indicator of certain behavior, but not a determinant of behavior.
Got it.
And I'm positive that this is like an age-old thing, but we didn't have podcasts in 1850 to talk about it.
Well, you can see in every articles where I guess I'm glad we're talking about this because it is an interesting topic, I think, to think about. And it's like Gen X was looked at the same way millennials were, just in the opposite manner. Well, they were lazy. They didn't want to do anything. They weren't corporate. They weren't their baby boomer, parent generation. And that all, they just kind of leaned in heavily. And obviously you got like grunge music, and they rebelled heavily against the corporate world. And all
I know.
that
was my era.
The same thing happened in the 60s too. So like this is kind of just a repeat of history. And I think you're just seeing it different ways as tech gets more and more involved in our lives. I think sometimes that also increases the disparage between the age gaps and can make it very obvious. When you are correct, it does not mean that all things that apply to millennials don't apply to baby boomers and vice versa.
Yeah, but you could take that back to Gutenberg and talk about the printing press pre and post and what it did to different generations. You could probably talk about, I don't know, the cotton gin, steam engines, like whatever else it is. I mean, if you're riding a horse to try and get across the country, and then the generation below you is sitting on a steam-powered engine, hurtling, relatively speaking, across the landscape, that's a massive change. Mm-hmm. The difference in generations between having a telephone and not having a telephone. Yeah. The impact of the post-Second World War baby boom on the creation of the suburbs, which then created the need for the mass transit systems, interstate highways, cars. Like, you could go back as far as you like. I think the rate and pace of change now is such that if in the past it was really about industrial production, like cars and roads and like things that are heavy and big and expensive to produce and require national effort to get done. Yes. Now it's like software is eating the world. Mm-hmm. Software is, for $5,000, you can basically get infinitely scalable infrastructure on AWS. Mm-hmm. You can go out and get open source libraries, do just about anything. You can get free Salesforce work if you want. Yeah. You can develop something there. Without question, right? And so the means of production, cost of production has gone down dramatically. The access to the tools is universal, right? Which, by the way, makes the global market more competitive, which is good and bad for people sitting in a desk somewhere. But also, you add those factors together, and you get just sort of this thing where data is probably the most important currency now all of a sudden. Yes. And access to information is the most important thing. Yeah. And young people have an information advantage as a consequence of technology, the way other people just didn't. Like when I used to write a paper in college, I'm not that old, but this is the advent of the internet was still ICQ. And, there was, I think my freshman year is when the Mosaic browser launched or Netscape launched.
Okay.
Yeah, Mosaic browser launched in like 94. So I went to the library, grabbed the whack of books, stacked them on a desk, and then like bang through them to try and write an essay, right? And I would usually write it out in longhand, and then I would go to the computer lab and type it up, right?
Yep.
And that's how everybody did work.
Yeah.
Now, theoretically, you have access to a lot more of a streamlined information kind of opportunity, but I think the expectations have also shifted. Because you have access to that, then I expect a different work product than if I made you read 300-page books and sift through them for great quotes and insight and all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
So to me, like technology will always have a force multiplier effect. And if you sit in between generations, it has like a massive impact versus I think my generation personally, I think we were in the seam, right? So I started college and the internet was becoming a thing.
Yes.
When I left, it was definitely a thing. But the mass consumption of the internet and mobile hadn't happened yet. And so I kind of got to live through a bunch of these big technological revolutions. Yeah. And because they're so compressed now, my step change is significantly easier than if it was like a 40-year product or technology cycle the way it used to be.
For sure. And I think that changes a lot of things too. One thing I think that gets associated with my generation so much is this fact of being an entitled generation. And I think, you do not have to comment on this, but I found myself kind of feeling that way, but not because I actually felt like I was entitled, but I think it's because everything happens so fast now, where in corporate world especially, things aren't like that. Like getting, whether it's promotion or getting tapped to do new projects or stuff like that, it's not just hey, you've been here 6 months, boom, you're done. It's maybe 2 years, and that's kind of just that time frame. Yep. And it's almost just relearning, the different culture that you're in, the different scenario that you're in, or whatever it may be, and not focusing on, I bought a light bulb on Amazon and it'll be at my apartment when I get home.
Yeah, or I posted a photo and I got 1,000 likes.
Yeah.
Because a month from now, I'm getting none.
Yes.
On that same photo, right? People have already done and dusted. The 24-hour news cycle started while I was in high school, probably. And now we're in just an infinite stream. Like it's a fire hose of information all the time. And so like I think it plays with people's understanding of the passing of time. And there's an immediacy to all of that. Yeah. And I don't even remotely think for a second that affects only one generation and not others.
Right.
Like we all have that expectation of immediacy now. And every conference you go to, when they talk about the impacts of technology on the consumer or anything else like that, like Amazon's in the top 3 things they talk about, right? It's probably Apple, Google, and Amazon or some combination there. Probably. And they've created these perceptions where like, things are just available immediately no matter what. But that doesn't work everywhere. And it's not everything moves at the same rate and pace. Yeah. And so people just need to be patient. And sometimes the real challenge is when you start talking about demographic issues. So experience is the most important one, right? The experience is somewhat linear and it is very highly correlated to time.
Yes.
And there's you can gain a lot of experience in a short period of time, but that's not the norm. And that may or may not scale either.
Right.
So I think that's where you get this I'm using air quotes around entitlement, because I feel like I don't believe entitlement is a generational trait necessarily. Yeah. I feel like every generation has a certain, it's probably likely more of like a percentage of population thing than anything else.
Yeah. Or things being construed as entitlement that maybe not be, because it's probably just the best describer of the word.
Sure. I also think we don't have a uniform definition of entitlement either.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So for me, it's the trickiest part as a leader is around the idea that experience is just difficult to get. And, what got you here won't get you there. And what worked in the past may or may not work in the future. But if it worked for you 10 times in the past, there's a higher correlation to it working an 11th time, but it's not a 100% correlated thing. Sure. So that's where you get the gaps where people are just like, oh, we've done this before. And then you get a lot of that is either explaining why you can't do something or why you should do something.
Yes.
But
we've always done it that way.
So
it's my least favorite answer in the world to any question.
Well, it depends on what the question is, right? Like some things are, I don't know, Why is sliced bread the way sliced bread is? Well, we've always done it that way. Well, it works well. It fits my toaster.
Fair enough. Right?
You know,
we built things around that slice.
yeah, that's exactly it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some things are like perfectly engineered for their environment.
That's true.
You
Or the
know?
need of them.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. So alligators haven't really evolved in like 100 million years because they're perfectly suited for their environment, right? They don't actually need to evolve anymore,
True.
but they still need to eat every day, and they still get a little smarter, and they still build whatever life lessons alligators build. I don't know what it is.
Maybe they're evolving under the water and we can't even see it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on once again. This has been wonderful, eye-opening for me. I have a couple of takeaways, so I hope people at home do. Anything you want to just leave the people with that are listening, that they can take to work, to life, anywhere?
I don't know. I
But
don't know why anyone would listen to my advice anyway. But just, I don't know, work hard, try and have fun. Don't take yourself too seriously, but be serious when it matters.
Okay.
I don't know, find opportunities to do stuff that provides balance in your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, find a partner or a hobby or something else that kind of challenges you and gets you out of your comfort zone, but doesn't necessarily correlate directly to your life ambitions or whatever's on your vision wall, right? Like, do things that scare you and be risky and try and have fun.
And don't take the L's too seriously.
Not too seriously. No, I mean, but you learn from them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. That was great. Thanks again. For all of you listening, I appreciate it. If you're listening, you already know where to find us. So tell other people where to find us. That's what will help us grow. That's what will help us get bigger. Big news did get dropped. I have none of it on our social. So if you're listening to this, you're probably the first to hear it. In November 14th, there will be a live podcast in downtown Milwaukee that we would love everybody to come to. It will be going on for 2 hours. So 2 hours of Eric and I talking. It may be a lot, but hopefully we'll break it up. And we'll have some awesome guests to talk over us. So once again, we appreciate listening. Tell your friends about us. If you're listening on iTunes, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and rate us. Give us a 1-star. If you think this is a 1-star podcast, let us know why so we can fix it. Hope you're having a great day, and we will see you next episode. Cheers.